Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this space to the International Manifesto Group. And I actually wanted to talk about Venezuela's democracy with a wider perspective after the elections that we just had and the elections that we are coming up. And since the issue of Venezuela for all those who are anti-imperialist and socialist is always on the table, I think it is important to reflect on really the content of Venezuela's democracy, which I actually think, because Venezuela's democracy is a sovereign democracy, is a project built by the people themselves. And that is one of the main key issues why U.S. imperialism goes against Venezuela with unilateral coercive measures. So everybody has heard it. In the Venezuelan constitution, it says that Venezuela's democracy is a participative and protagonic democracy. What does this actually mean? This actually means that we do have, let's say, conventional elections like we had on the 25th and like the ones we are going to have at the end of July. But it actually means too, and this is very important, that our democracy is not a restricted democracy. From my perspective, um, Occidental liberal democracy, however we want to call it, bourgeois democracy, is actually a tremendously restricted democracy. In fact, we could even say that it is oftentimes a democracy that just covers up the interests, but essentially ends up representing the interests of the elites of the bourgeoisie. So, what is participative and protagonic democracy? Well, it actually goes back to 1991, 1992, when Chavez wrote the book when Chavez wrote a book that's called El Libro Azul, the Blue Book. I recommend that everybody read it. In this book, he basically examines the state of Venezuela's so-called democracy at that time, analyzing that indeed it was a very restricted democracy, a democracy that did not allow for the actual uh, plurality and the radical intents of an important sector of the Venezuelan society in terms of building a just society. So we are already talking about 1991, but of course in the Constitutional Assembly, that's the first moment, we are talking about 1999, the Constitutional Assembly, when the people of Venezuela made their own democracy. That is another exercise in substantive democracy, and this is a term that I am going to use because we can say participative and protagonic democracy, but I like to use a term that is oftentimes used by Marx, substantive democracy, that basically puts the content back into the idea of democracy. As we know, as Alice has said, actually the U.S. calls itself the country that promotes democracy, and they go in one war after another, killing people, killing millions of people in the name of democracy, which is really not at all democratic. So we have these periods, but we also have, and I think I want to end up talking about a little bit about the commune, because I think it is the fullest expression of the profound substantive democracy that we have in Venezuela. As I said, we have conventional processes of democracy, like the one that we had on the 25th, like the one we will have in a month. But we have these other expressions of democracy that go to the grassroots. So expressions of popular democracy where you don't only choose a representative every 2, 4, 6 years. You, in conventional liberal democracies, you choose who will represent you, as Engels said, to in truth represent the interests of the minority, of the bourgeoisie. So our democracy is much more rich, a much richer democracy. Beginning in the very early days of the Bolivarian process, there were exercises of substantive grassroots assembly-based democracy, such as the tables for water, land use spaces, and all these spaces were actually grassroots spaces where people democratically in assemblies without representatives decided how to solve their problems. This escalated virtuously towards the communal councils in 2006. And the communal councils are territorial spaces where the people in a barrio, in a neighborhood, in the campo, in the countryside, decide, reflect, deliberate on what their major problems are, and look for ways to solve them. And look for ways to solve them hand in hand with the government and the state, because Bolivarian democracy, sometimes when we talk about it quickly, it may seem like an anarchistic project because it's just people solving their problems on their own. But no, it's not about people solving problems on their own. It is about people solving problems on their own, hand in hand with the government that is committed to the collective emancipation of the Venezuelan people. So 2006, the Communal Council, and 2009 is a very interesting year for us, a very important year for us. I am part of a commune and I am common art. So 2009 is a very important year because that's when Chavez begins to talk about the communes. And the communes are profoundly democratic spaces, not only because, as in the Communal Council, people in assemblies decide what their problems are and with the government look about how to solve them, but communes are truly the pathway towards Bolivarian socialism, 21st century socialism. You may remember that in 2005, 2006, Chavez was already talking about socialismo del siglo XXI, 21st century socialism. But of course, it is one thing to promote an objective, and it is another very different thing to actually build a roadmap to how to, in terms of how to achieve that objective. And the commune is, in fact, the roadmap to Venezuela's socialism. Why? As I was saying, one, there is assembly, but two, and this is very, very important, I often say that Venezuela's communes and Venezuela's participative and protagonic democracy as we know it today walks on two legs, is that communes should have the means of production, and the type of property in communes is communal, direct social property. And what does that actually mean? That in the communes that are privileged to have a means of production, and I should say that not all communes have means of production, but the communes that have means of production, the property is collective. That means that it is, of course, not private property. It is not state property. It is not cooperative property. It is the property of the whole of the community. What is built in Las Abejitas del Panal, which is a means of production in my commune, that what happens with the surplus is decided collectively in the assembly by the neighbors, by the communards of the community. So we are talking about a substantive democracy that does not only have expressions of formal traditional democracy, that does not only have expressions of assembly-based decision-taking to solve problems, but that also has it should have, eventually, we are in a transition, it should have the control of the economy. Of course, we live generally speaking, we live in a capitalist world, and the exploitation of workers means that actually workers do not have a say in terms of what happens with their surplus. Of course, they are exploited, and that does not happen in that. It is an objective to overcome that in socialism, and that does not happen in communist exploitation. Through the means of production, communards have this control of the economic spaces within the commune. So I think that these things are very important when we think about, and I will ask, because I am actually not keeping track of my time, for someone to give me a sign if I should be wrapping up. But I wanted to bring up because as we are actually, oftentimes, I have 2 more minutes, great. As it is true that we have many, we could say, conventional electoral processes in Venezuela, more than 34 since the beginning of the Bolivarian process, which is frankly sometimes taxing, but it is necessary. Since we have this reality, it oftentimes gets related, the story of Venezuela's democracy. Well, of course, we know how the enemy represents it, but even within the ranks of those who are solidarios of the anti-imperialists, who are solidarios with the Bolivarian Revolution, with this sovereign project that looks towards socialism, with this anti-imperialist project that looks to build a sovereign society, our democracy oftentimes gets represented just on the basis of this electoral process. And I think it's very, very, very important for people who are solidarious with our revolution to understand that, yes, those moments are important, but actually what happens in the communes, in the popular consultations, which are an initiative that the government began a little bit over a year ago, in which people, again, in the communes and in the communal circuits, meet in assemblies, decide what their main projects are. Then they actually get the resources from the government, and they vote on the projects, and they themselves execute the project. So these are exercises of direct participation from the beginning to the end. So I just wanted to say, and I will wrap it up here, that when folks think about our democracy, please do not just think about these electoral processes, which we have to talk about, but also let's think about the profound substantive democracy that we are building. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.